GCP's Private Service Connect is more or less analogous to AWS's Private Link, and it allows you to selectively expose services, which is in contrast to VPC peering, whereby everything in each of the peered VPCs is able to interact with everything in the other. You might not be in a position to VPC peer. For example, your CIDR ranges in both of the VPCs might overlap. You might have already reached your VPC connection limit of 25, or you might not want to create an internet gateway to your VPC. Today, I'll show you how to configure GCP's Private Service Connect to connect to CockroachDB from your VPC. First, I'll export some environment variables. Next, I'll create a CockroachDB cluster, exporting its cluster ID into a new environments file. I'll fetch the SQL DNS for the first region and send that to the same environments file. I'll add those to my environment, and then I'll generate a random password and my database connection string. Let's check on the status of the cluster, and within a couple of seconds, it'll be ready for me to create a user. I'll create a user called Rob with the password I generated earlier. And with the user created, I'll connect to the cluster and return the cluster version. To connect CockroachDB to GCP's Private Service Connect, I'll need a couple of details from CockroachDB. The first is the endpoint service ID, which will be the target service ID referenced by GCP, and the cluster routing ID, which will be the endpoint name. We'll fetch those now, and then we can create the infrastructure in GCP. I'll fetch the endpoint service ID. I'll fetch the cluster routing ID. I'll create a VPC in GCP. I'll open it up to SSH connections. And now I'll create the Private Service Connect endpoint in GCP. Over in GCP, I've gone to the Private Service Connect page, and I'll click Connect Endpoint. It's a published service, the target service being the published service ID from CockroachDB, the endpoint name being the cluster routing ID. The network will be the VPC I created earlier. I'll create an IP address. I'll enable global access, and then I'll select a namespace. The endpoint is now creating, and when it finishes in a couple of seconds, I'll copy the Private Service Connect connection ID. I can now accept the connection from CockroachDB's end, and that says the status is available. And now I'll fetch the cluster's internal DNS name. This should now be accessible from within the VPC, but not accessible from outside of the VPC. I'll demonstrate that now. I'll fetch the internal DNS and add it to my environments file, source it, and show that it's not working from outside of the VPC. It's looking up the internal address, and there's no such host. I'll create a VM in GCP on the VPC network, and I'll make metadata available to that VM called database, whose value is the internal database URL environment variable that I just created. With that running, I'll connect to it via SSH. The VM is still spinning up, so I'll try again in a couple of seconds. I'll fetch the database connection string from the available attribute metadata and set it as an environment variable. Then I'll download the Cockroach binary, extract it, and CD into the resulting directory, and connect to the cluster using the internal DNS name. And we're in. With this configuration, I can now consume a managed CockroachDB service from within inside my VPC as if it existed within my VPC, which is great if you need the security of working from within a VPC and not necessarily exposing your traffic to the internet. Communication between my applications on my own VPC and CockroachDB's VPC will all happen on Google's backbone and won't therefore be exposed to the internet.